Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. We're going to talk today about crystalline silica. There's a new standard coming out in about a month. There's one that was started about the end of last year, August of 2017, and it's affected construction, general industry, and the maritime industry. So we're going to introduce you to what is required and what you need to know for these new standards. Let's start off with a little housekeeping. Today's webinar is being brought to you by Workrite Safety. Workrite is a unique occupational consulting company that provides services for the prevention and management of work-related injuries and compliance issues. You can go to workrite.safety.com to find out more information. I'm your presenter today. I'm Dr. Dave Thorpe. Aside from being president of Workrite Safety, I'm also board certified in occupational health. I'm also an ergonomist, and I've been working in occupational medicine for greater than 30 years. I'm on the faculty, postgraduate faculty of a couple of different colleges and universities, most importantly at Northwestern Health Sciences University, and I teach courses in occupational health and in ergonomics. So what are your takeaways going to be? What's on the agenda? What are you going to learn today? We're going to introduce you to what crystalline silica is. We'll talk about how workers are exposed to crystalline silica. We'll look at the standard itself, both that for construction and that for general industry and maritime, and what it requires. We'll take a look at the types of industries and jobs that are affected. We'll look at control methods. These are engineering controls, work practice controls, and personal protection equipment, in particular respirators. We'll look at also at some of the additional things that are required by the standard. And in particular, we'll take a close look at what is required through medical surveillance exams. At the end, we should have time for questions and answers. And the way we're going to do this is that you will hold your questions until the end of the webinar and then type them in, and I'll read them out loud and then answer them to the best of my ability. So let's get started. What is respirable crystalline silica? Crystalline silica is a very common mineral found in sand, stone, artificial stone, concrete, brick, and mortar. As a matter of fact, and as a little trivia comment here, if you remember the white sand from the sandbox when we were a kid, unfortunately they don't make that anymore. That's because it contains silica. And now the sand is a tannish or a brownish color, etc. So there's a reason why. Now, workers are exposed to this when they cut, grind, or drill into materials that contain silica, or use industrial sand for like sandblasting. This causes very small silica dust particles to become airborne. They're in the air, and they're breathable. And we inhale them in the form of silica dust. These particles can travel into the worker's lungs and cause conditions such as silicosis, and even lead to such conditions as lung cancer, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, commonly associated with chronic smoking or long-term smoking, but it can also be caused by exposure to silica. And also, one of the interesting parts is the fact that it can lead to kidney failure and other forms of kidney disease. In most cases, these diseases occur after years of exposure to respirable crystalline silica. Let's take a look at some statistics as it relates to silicosis. In the United States, there's anywhere from 3,600 to 7,300 new cases of silicosis reported annually, and about 100 deaths occur each year as a direct result of silicosis. Certainly, many more probably die each year as an indirect relationship to silicosis, such as some of the other medical conditions we just mentioned, such as lung cancer. Now, up till now, medical surveillance has not been required. That means many cases of silicosis have not been reported or diagnosed. So it's expected, because of this new standard, that we'll have some more accurate information about this. Of note is silicosis itself is not curable. It's only preventable. The only known treatment for advanced silicosis is a lung transplant. Now, there are three different types of silicosis. There's acute silicosis. This occurs within a few weeks or years, usually after high-level exposure to silica dust. Then there's chronic silicosis. This develops after 10 or more years of low-level exposure. And then there's accelerated silicosis. Very similar to chronic silicosis. It develops within 10 years, however, but it's due to being exposed to high levels of respirable silica. What are some of the symptoms? Symptoms can include such things as a persistent cough, shortness of breath and rapid breathing, to as much as chest pain, fever, chills, and even certain types of heart problems. The most common being on the right side of the heart, right-sided heart failure called cor pulmonale. That's because silica dust affects the lungs, and the right side of the heart is connected to the lungs. How are workers exposed to crystalline silica? Let's take a look at the two different types of standards in industries that we're talking about today. In the construction industry, exposure occurs from using masonry saws, grinders, drills, jackhammers, handheld power chipping tools, etc. Also, if you're operating vehicles that have mounted drilling rigs, or if you get involved with milling, crushing machines, heavy equipment for demolition and abrasive blasting, sandblasting, for example, tunneling, all these things will increase your exposure and lead to some problems and requirements, control measures in particular, relating to this exposure. Now let's take a look at general industry and maritime. And if you look at the table to the right here, you can see that there are a number of different industries in ways that you can become exposed. Working with concrete, working in foundries, oil and gas operations, railroads, pottery, jewelry, shipyards. Go all the way down, you can even see dental labs. The numbers of people that are exposed, including those exposed above the PEL, permissible exposure limit, and I'll talk about that in a second, is astounding. What is the standard and what does it require? We're going to look at each standard, one for construction and the other one for general industry and maritime separately. Construction, the standard is 29 CFR. CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations. 1926-1153. This went into effect last August. This requires employers to limit exposures to respirable crystalline silica and to take other steps to protect workers. Now, there's a table that you can get off of the OSHA website. If you put in the standard number and list table 1, you can get a copy of it, or you can call us for a copy. It matches 18 common construction tasks with effective dust control methods, such as using water to keep dust from getting into the air, or using a vacuum dust collection system to capture dust. In some operations, respirators may be needed also. Employers that follow Table 1, this is for construction now, correctly, if they follow Table 1 correctly and they're not required and not subject to do testing and not subject to a PEL, permissible exposure limit. Now let's take a look at general industry and maritime. That's 29 CFR 1910-1053. That goes into effect in the third week of June, around June 22nd or 23rd of this year. Employers are to determine the amount of silica that workers are exposed to. The action level, or the level that you need to start monitoring, is at 25 micrograms per cubic meter, averaged over an 8-hour day. And if it gets to 50 micrograms per cubic meter, they must go into protective measures now for any worker exposed to this level, 50 micrograms or greater over an 8-hour day. How do they do that? They must limit access to areas above the PEL. They must use control measures, we'll talk about that in a second, and safer work methods above the PEL. They must provide respirators to workers when control measures and safe work methods cannot limit exposures above the PEL. And lastly, when it comes to housekeeping, they must restrict housekeeping practices that expose workers to silica. An example that I put down here is the use of compressed air without ventilation. Let's talk about those control measures. And like I said, There are three types of control measures. There's engineering controls. Those are direct changes to the workstation itself. There's work practice controls. Those are changes to how we do our work. And then there's personal protection equipment. These are things like respirators. In the construction industry, like I said, Table 1 has a list of control measures, and you should all get a copy of that. Alternative control measures to be implemented above the PEL include dust controls, dust collection systems, and water controls, and safer work methods, limiting the time of exposure, for example, to protect workers from silica. You need to also provide respirators to workers when these controls are not possible. Now, in general industry and maritime, you also have to use the same three-step process. Dust controls such as wet methods, exhaust ventilation, and enclosures all are designed, these are engineering controls, to reduce exposure to silica. Safer work methods, ways of reducing or limiting your exposure time, that's a good idea, such as rotation of workers. And lastly, as mentioned before, respirators, and those are probably the most commonly used in both construction and general industry to limit exposure to silica. What else is required? A written exposure control plan that identifies tasks that involve exposure and methods to use to protect workers, including procedures that restrict access to work areas with high exposures. So you have to have a written exposure control plan. You also have to designate a competent person to administer and manage the plan. This is typically HR or safety. Also, medical surveillance exams for workers have to be provided for workers who are exposed to crystalline silica at or above the PEL. This has to be provided at no charge to workers, and it typically will be provided during the workday. Training is required also on the health effects of silica exposure, workplace tasks that can expose them to silica, and ways to limit exposure. As far as record keeping goes, workers' silica exposure and medical exams must be maintained for employment plus 30 years, so that's quite some time. All right. Surveillance exams. What are those requirements? Now, there's a difference here in a medical surveillance exam for crystalline silica than what is required for the medical evaluation for respirator use. In particular, it must be a clinical exam. It must be performed on the worker who is exposed for 30 or more days to silica dust. It must be provided for pre-placement purposes. That means any new hire who's going to be working in an environment that includes silica, or anyone who's being transferred into a department or a position that exposes them to silica dust. There must be a reevaluation every 3 years on that same individual. In addition to the clinical exam, you must also have a chest x-ray. This will help determine if they're developing silicosis and one other problem, which is tuberculosis. Those individuals who have silicosis are at greater risk for developing TB. So to go along with that, a TB test is going to be required. This has to be either the Mantow test or an IGRA test. IGRA stands for interferon gamma release assay. It's a blood test. Now, what would I recommend in either one of those circumstances? I'd have to say that because the Mantow test is a test that would require the worker to come back to see the doctor again 2 to 3 days later to see if it's positive or negative, and the blood test, the IGRA blood test, would be something where it could be drawn from the worker on the day of their exam, and the report goes back to the doctor typically within 24 hours that they're positive or negative. So I would recommend the blood test. Lastly, pulmonary function testing is required. Most importantly, spirometry is done both for pre-placement and reevaluation to determine baseline lung function, as well as how things are developing over time. So we'll see if there's any change in lung function over time. Now, reports from the PLHCP. PLHCP stands for physician or other licensed healthcare practitioner. That is any provider who can perform a clinical exam. Registered nurses, RNs, cannot do so, but nurse practitioners, DCs, medical physicians of any type, PAs, etc., all can perform a physical exam. These reports from the PLHCP must be provided to the employer within 30 days. It goes from the examiner to the employer and the employer to the employee. Now realize this, the report to the employer can't be opened by the employer. The one for the employee, which will be provided by the PLHCP, will be provided in an enclosed envelope. That must be handed to the employee, and that is confidential information. So the employer is unable to open that. Now, if the employee is determined to have had exposure at a level with crystalline silica, at a level that would require a specialist evaluation, this specialist evaluation will be made known to the employee in the written report, and it must be made available to the employer, or by the employer to the worker, at no cost to the worker. So the employer will have to pay for it. Okay, I have pretty much reached the end of our presentation today, and it is time for questions and answers. So if anybody would like to type in a question for me, let me see if I have any. I do have one question from John. Who determines the PEL? PEL is actually determined by OSHA, and whether or not your workers are exposed to the permissible exposure limit will be based on your testing. Who's going to conduct that? An environmentalist or industrial hygienist typically will do environmental testing that will help identify what your exposure levels are. And if they reach the PEL, then you have to get into the surveillance process as defined as we've seen. Are there any other questions? Okay, I don't see any right now. So I'm going to thank everyone for their attendance today. If you have any questions that you come up with, after the webinar is over, you can send them directly to me at drthorpe@workrightsafety.com, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible with an answer. Also, if you'd like to see additional webinars in the future, we are going to have webinars available on a relatively regular basis on a variety of different topics. So as we set them up, we'll be inviting each and every one of you. Again, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and attendance today.